Hello and welcome to the State of Open Data Roundtables covering climate action. We started the live stream. We will be waiting for the audiences to join. And then we're going to do a little bit of introductions. I would already like to invite people to participate in this, as this is a very interactive session. So while we are waiting for people to come on, please, there's one way that we will have throughout the event, which is going to menti.com, typing in the code that's currently on the screen. There's also a QR code if you wanted to join directly to that through your phone or your laptop. And there's 2 questions about the challenges and then about the opportunities for climate data. And then there's also Q&A that's included in this. So we will give participants just a couple of minutes to join on, and then we will kick this off.
All right, while everyone's getting logged in, probably a good time for me to say good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Mushiri Nyaga from the Local Development Research Institute, and on behalf of the Data for Development Global Research Hub, d4d.net, I'd like to thank you for joining us and say welcome. This roundtable hosted by Johannes, thank you very much. A part of an effort to refresh the State of Open Data report that was originally published in 2019. A lot has happened since, of course, and the intention is to refresh the report so that it brings everyone up to speed on what has happened between then and now. These roundtables are going to be a really important part of getting your voices and your perspectives into the refreshed content. Of course, you can see the existing State of Open Data report online at stateofopendata.od4d.net. We look forward to engaging with everyone on that as we make that journey. So Johannes, welcome. Johannes is our chair today. He's the Director of Climate Data at the World Resources Institute, which is a global research organization that addresses urgent sustainability challenges related to food forests, water, climate, energy, cities, and the ocean. He leads WRI's data strategy on climate, energy, and systems change, and also supports WRI's institutional strategy to turn data and visualizations into action as an advisor to Ocean Watch, Resource Watch, and the Data Lab. So I hope I have done your introduction justice, Johannes.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Yeah. So to get this started, we have 2 panelists, and obviously, like me, also sharing some opinions on this roundtable. We're trying to keep it pretty interactive in a sense that we will give you a little bit of interventions, a little bit of framing of the problem, some opinions and perspectives. But the main thing is that we would want to see participation. There's several ways. Again, I'm going to mention this several times for people who've joined. There's the Menti, where the link is in the chat of the Zoom meeting, and I'm also going to bring it up on the screen in a second. There's a Q&A in the Menti, as well as you can also use the Q&A of the Zoom meeting. We will monitor all of them, so definitely feel free to make your points of opinion. Before I pull up my little introduction, I just want to ask our 2 panelists to introduce themselves. Angel Xu, who's the assistant professor at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and also the founder and director of the Data-Driven Environmental Lab. Angel, do you want to do a quick introduction?
Yes, yeah, sure. I think you did a great job. But yes, again, Angel Xu. I recently moved from Singapore, where I was working at Yale and US College, and relocated back home to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I founded and direct a research group called the Data-Driven EnviroLab, as Johannes mentioned, and our mission is to apply cutting-edge data-driven approaches at the intersection of urbanization, environment, and climate change. And so we've been working for the last several years on this question of how do we open up data, particularly for the myriad of actors that are now engaged in climate action globally. So I'll talk more about that in a second. But thanks so much, Johannes, for the invitation.
Thank you, Angel. And we have Aniket Ghai, who is the Senior Economic Affairs Officer at the United Nations Office of the High Representative for Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and Small Island Development States. That's a long acronym. Thank you for joining us. If you want to do a quick introduction.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you also for the invitation to join this panel. A couple of things about my background. So I worked previously at the UNFCCC Secretariat, where I was focusing actually on the Annex 1 party communications and their commitments, and the process of reviewing what they were doing to implement their convention commitments and Kyoto Protocol commitments. I've also worked for quite a few years for the UN Environment Programme, both in Geneva and Nairobi, and then more recently in the Secretary General's office under Ban Ki-moon in New York. And now, as you mentioned, I'm working in this small office that's dedicated to the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states, where we look at really an advocacy role, helping these countries to mobilize resources, and then also critically supporting both the implementation of their dedicated programs of action. So each one of these groups of countries, which we say are countries in special situations, what do we need to do to help them achieve sustainable development, the SDGs, and we have developed individual programs of action for them. Most recently, we concluded the new 10-year program of action for the LDCs, known as the Doha Program of Action. That was in March of this year, and there's a whole chapter or a whole focus area on building resilience, on adaptation, on climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction. So that's what we do, and I look forward to going into more details later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining. Just pulling this up again, I will, just to give a framing for what we're trying to do in this hour that we have with the goals of the roundtable, because some people might come into this and being this is like, oh, I want to know about the state of climate, state of open climate data. This is really a roundtable where we try to get input. It's an update for the previous report by Data for Development, where we're being tasked or asked to write a short update blog. So we want to, before we even finish an outline for this, we want to make sure that we bring a wide range of perspectives in. So this is really a discussion. We want to hear your opinions. We want to hear your perspective. This is not just going to be a presentation, even though we'll try to give a good examples. We're trying to tell you what we might think might be good priorities, or might be particularly challenges that might be addressed. Again, I'm gonna show you very quickly in the meantime, because we're gonna make it way more interesting if you are listening to my quick summary. There's a link in the chat, as well as there's a Menti. Let me make sure that I'm actually sharing my full screen so you can see it. There's a whole Menti site where you can go to menti.com, type in this code that's here, or type in the link from the chat, and there will be 2 questions, and I will use this kind of as a hub to see what kind of ideas the audience has about opportunities and challenge, and there will also be a Q&A there. Again, you can use this or the Zoom Q&A. So it should be fairly straightforward. You just type it in. You can provide several answers, so you can always restart the survey and input more answers. I hope this is going to be helpful to make it interactive. But having said this, I just want to start this with a little bit of a framing. What do we mean by open climate data? It's actually like often not too easy to define, and when people come often with a certain bias to it and saying it's like, here's like the perspective that I have around climate data, but they might only think about a subset of situation, geographies, or topics. Climate change is obviously one of the major challenges we have to address essentially, and very rapidly. But it also touches on pretty much all of the parts of our economy, many parts of our society, finance systems, and so on. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea on like how could we even frame that question? What might be, if you think about challenges and opportunities, what do we think about climate data? This is a quick chart that I actually just put together yesterday. Looking at the major existing indicator frameworks that different organizations, for example, the UN Statistical Commissions, has published around what are the most important data sets for climate. I'll also put this in the link, because you can actually explore this, a good way to explore it, to see like what kind of indicators they actually saying might be included in climate change. It has a much broader perspective than, for example, some people might be thinking about emissions or some economic data. There's a wide range of perspectives in there. This kind of just gives you a little bit, I just put this together as a quick inspiration of when we think about the types of climate data, what could we actually think about? This includes everything from mitigation, adaptation, finance, to just transition, vulnerability, resilience, to different scales, from global to very local, to just monitoring what was in the past, looking prescriptively what might be in the future, different sectors, and also different actors who both create the data as well as might be using the data. And you will get a variety of these kind of like specific examples of how this looks like in very different situations. There is also a different perspective that we're currently exploring, which I think might be helpful for this audience as well, which is a systems perspective. We're currently working with a lot of partners on the Systems Change Lab. This also helps us to formulate the climate problem from a data monitoring perspective on a multi-level, and saying just like, we have specific sectors which are not only the emission sectors, but also like sectors like ocean, the governance, and shifts that need to happen in there. We need to electrify, we need to address the plastic problems, and then there's the drivers of what actually might drive these kind of shifts. So it's another things where you can feel free to go to systemschangelab.org. It's not the alpha site is going to be published in the next couple of months. It's not a finished product yet or something, but it's just a different kind of perspective on when we think about what we actually mean by climate data, or what is actionable climate data that actually addresses some underlying issues of what we need to achieve. And then the third type of like framework to just like spark a little bit of the thinking that I want to supply here is the data challenges in the data value chain. And this is again like something that is put together as a strawman really quick, because many of us, particularly who are working on the data side of things, might be thinking, when they think about climate data, as things like, what indicators can I create? Can I create a map? Here is that data not available. But this is actually just one part. There is to really address the data, to make data particularly actionable. It's the question of, is it actually, not only is it there, does it have the right granularity, but is it usable? Does it help the people on the ground that actually might need to make decisions, or might need to do planning? Does it provide the analytical functions, even if the data is perfect and it's very accessible and very easily understandable? Is it actually used? Are there, and this is particularly some of the perspectives that we're going to discuss, is data the main barrier? Is there enough capacity? And other questions. So kind of go to the final thing, being this is like, we want to have data for a purpose, not just as a purpose, to really see how it can address certain problems. To give you just an example, because I like examples. You have always these broad frameworks, and like examples to tell you what I mean. We had these interesting discussions about we need adaptation, we need to adapt to climate change and climate impacts. How do we do this? Okay, if you just say this very broadly, it's very hard to identify this data. So you need to focus on a specific problem. Let's say we're looking for food production. What is the specific perspective around food production? It can be a supply chain of food production. So that is already a very concrete example, but then it depends on what kind of crops you're looking at and what kind of geography. So let's say we're zooming into some a coffee plantation in Colombia and saying this is like, how might they actually need to address and adapt to climate change? And then it's the question of who are the actors that would actually help these planning. Oh, this could be, for example, farmer organizations. And then it kind of provides you with a perspective of what do these organizations might actually need. Is it just like general high-level data? Is it just this like massive models of like rainfall and flooding and temperature changes, or these are actually very specific tools? So it's good to kind of think through the narrow need, the need very well, and kind of feed that back into the whole value chain to make sure that we really understand what is needed to be addressed. And then as another perspective that's not really in here, but it's also important, is avoiding unintended use. So in this example, that's actually a very concrete one that we've been thinking about with WRI around some of the data and tools that we've been creating on how to support resilience building. It was a question of unintended use. If we make this data available, which are some of the coffee plantations that are most vulnerable, are we just shifting? Are we bringing the data to the most powerful, which might be the actual suppliers, the organization's supply chain, then just shift to other providers and leave the most vulnerable behind instead of helping them to adapt more or to become more resilient? There might be unintended uses that we also have to keep in mind. So this is kind of like a little bit of examples that we're going to discuss, kind of things, and a little bit just a very broad perspective. But I hope we can make this very concrete. Here are some examples. Also hope that you can put some examples in the Menti. But with having said all of this, I actually want to start to ask our panelists initially some probing questions. And then we're actually going to, after we hear from them a little bit, we're going to go back and monitor the Q&A and the other suggestions, and then start picking up some things and actually discussing this. So I'm just going to go to Angel first. I know as the founder and director of the Data Driven Lab, you've worked a lot on different challenges, basically, particularly around climate action and national climate action, how it works on multiple levels, not only on the national level, because often we only think about the national level, but there's also a lot of action happening in cities, states, companies, and so on. I'd love to hear a little bit your perspective of what you've seen around particular challenges and opportunities. And I stop my screen share.
Yeah, thanks so much, Johannes. And I really loved your opening framing. I think these are exactly the questions that we need to be asking. And in the world where we're generating petabytes and petabytes of data every single day, it's overwhelming. And so this deluge of data and information, being able to seek the clear signal through the noise to understand, well, are our actions on climate change actually leading and addressing a particular challenge that we set out to embark upon? I mean, I think that's really critical. And in particular, the myriad of actors now that are participating on climate action, which I alluded to in my introduction. This is a problem and a challenge that we've been focusing on since the Paris Agreement was negotiated in 2015. And it, for the first time, recognized the contribution of all levels of government and various actors to help achieve that very critical 1.5 degree temperature containment. And so our group has been working on collating and developing data sets to really understand the landscape of non-state and subnational climate action. So by non-state actors, I mean private companies, nonprofit organizations, financial institutions, and subnational, we're talking about small towns that can be just a couple hundred people to major megacities of 10 million or more. And so this landscape is incredibly fragmented. It's highly heterogeneous because all of these diverse actors, they're reporting to different initiatives and platforms in different ways. And all of these networks and platforms have their own requirements of what they're asking the participants to do. So some of them may report information about their commitments. So how much they're planning to reduce their carbon emissions, or if it's on adaptation, what kinds of efforts on adaptation or resilience building are they working on? And so in terms of trying to make sense and aggregate all this data together, that's been a primary challenge. And so we've been applying next generation techniques, machine learning, for example, natural language processing, and different types of algorithmic processes to try to collate and make sense of this. So that's one challenge, the highly fragmented nature. And then I think another challenge that you may have picked up based on what I just said is the fact that all of this data is primarily self-reported. So we're relying on the actors themselves to be open and transparent about their own efforts and what their baseline emissions are, if they are contributing additional information that can help track progress against those initial targets and efforts. It's all self-reported. And so they can choose what to include and disclose and when, and what sources also to include in that. And so the result is incomparable. It's often incomplete because some actors may choose emissions data or certain pieces of data that are most relevant for them. And so if you're trying to get a comprehensive, complete picture, that's really challenging. And so just as an example, for the last 3 years, a consortium of different research groups, including our research lab, New Climate Institute, Oxford University, I'm sorry about the ambulance noise in the background, but we've been working on developing an analysis to understand what is the potential contribution of all of these different actors and their commitments to global mitigation and helping to narrow that emissions gap. And so what we found is that most of the data is coming from the global north and from Europe. And so I'm hoping that Aniket can talk more about this from the global south perspective, because that's where we're seeing most of the gaps. And so we're really only able to get a very tip of the iceberg and only from the global north and primarily from European actors. And so that doesn't give us a nearly comprehensive or complete enough picture of what's actually happening. And then, so when we see that more than 90% of this inventory data, I'm just talking about for mitigation and for emissions, is coming from the global north and from Europe, that's really very incomplete. And then out of all of the actors that are participating in climate action, only 10% we've evaluated have actually sufficient data that we can use to track actual progress. So that was a lot of the challenges, but I want to leave you on a more positive note in terms of the opportunities. So I think there are a lot of opportunities happening right now to improve this state of data on multi-level and polycentric climate action. I think one is the global stocktake. So just last week, there were technical dialogues that began as part of this process for evaluating progress towards the Paris Agreement. And so that's what's referred to as this global stocktake. It's occurring in 5-year cycles. And the idea is that everyone, including national governments, all the way down to subnational and non-state actors, will be contributing data to help us understand how far we still need to go in order to achieve our climate goals. And then the theory is that we can, these different actors can ratchet up ambition in this virtuous cycle. So I think there's a lot of opportunity within this process to elevate the importance of everybody contributing and trying to be transparent on their climate actions. And there's a specific call for understanding subnational and non-state climate action and contributions. I think another big opportunity is digital technology. And so we have a project right now that's funded by the Carnegie Corporation in partnership with Open Earth Foundation, which is based in California. And so we're looking into the ability of digital technologies like blockchain, distributed ledgers, and I know it's a lot of buzzwords, but also Earth observation, satellites, and sensors to help fill in gaps, because we simply cannot continue to rely on self-reported data for people to decide under what conditions, what sources, what pieces of information that they want to be open about, because the climate frankly cannot wait. And so there's a lot of movement happening in the space. Startups like Persephone and Watershed are helping companies utilize artificial intelligence and machine learning and some of these new data sources to fill in gaps in their inventories to make the burden of reporting less onerous. You have new satellites like Carbon Mapper that are going up in the atmosphere every day. Climate Trace is a consortium that's backed by Google and Al Gore that's trying to bring together a lot of these nonprofits and companies that are working on these next generation approaches to be radically transparent about the state of emissions. And so I know I went over my 4 minutes, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of my perspective of where I'm coming from at this question of the state of open climate data.
Thank you, Angel. and I do think we have a good amount of time. I will monitor the questions that might come in. So we'll have more time to discuss. And then Aniket, I'd love to hear your perspective, particularly working with the most vulnerable countries where there might be often some capacity lacking that is like often not thought about, like particularly if you like work at research institutions or create climate data, in how much like this data can be actually used by local organizations. So I'd love to hear your perspective and your experiences in this area.
Thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you again for the invitation. At the outset, I'll just say that environmental data and climate change data in particular are especially important both for the public to know and also for decision makers to make savvy decisions. And also it's very linked to the mandates that have been given to government officials and others. And whether these are sort of local government or national government. I think the importance of this is, in fact, even reflected in the fact that we've got a dedicated convention on the matter, a multilateral environmental agreement known as the Aarhus Convention, which has actually been elaborated within the context of the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And the full title is the Aarhus Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation and Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. So not only is the whole question of climate data related to action and mitigation and being able to make informed evidence-based decisions, but it's also linked to this whole notion of what the public have a right to know. So, well, as we've alluded, developing countries face very specific constraints when it comes to gathering high quality, comparable data, in particular time series data, which is essential for making projections for a number of things, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Well, just I think the challenges are well known. They have been articulated in frequently, and they can include too few staff, lack of finance, knowledge gaps, institutions need strengthening in order to do some of the analysis. Data collection systems are sometimes not in place. In the case of climate change, very often data resides in many different parts. If we look, for example, just at the national context and the role and responsibility of national authorities in terms of reporting on climate change, they've got to collect data which is residing in many different parts. This is a challenge that faces all governments, but not just developing country governments. But then there's also gaps in methodologies. Frequently, if you want individual greenhouse gas emission sort of tailored to your specific circumstances, you've got to do bottom-up modeling, and that requires capacity, it requires time as well. And then also, the whole question of adaptation is a sort of challenge unto itself, which I will come to in a minute. So really, and then another sort of new challenge really is one that's related to the new reporting requirements under the Paris Agreement. So while we've had capacity built up in developing countries over the years, particularly on greenhouse gas emission inventories, in the beginning, 20, 30, 25 years ago, very few systems were in place and the quality of greenhouse gas data were not very high quality, but these have been improved and built up upon over the years as we've had, as we've been improving the methods and the data calculations and the gathering of activity data and developing individual emission factors for specific tailored to specific country situations. Just to cite an example, among the first voluntary national reviews, which is slightly different because we also have to remember that climate change data has to be also measured against the other data gathering requirements. And in 2015, we had a whole generation of new data gathering requirements that governments had to do, which includes the SDGs. So in the very first voluntary national reviews, many developing countries, and particularly the ones that we work with, which are the LDCs, the landlocked developing and the SIDS, some of them reported 30% data gaps in the SDGs. So all these gaps have to be filled over time, and they are being, but it does take resources and so on. On the plus side, in the Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction, which includes some very important climate data, there in the initial years, we have something called the Sendai Framework Monitor, which is a publicly accessible source of data where governments report on data that are required under this or that reflect the implementation of their commitments under the Sendai framework. We have seen an increase in coverage and a progression in coverage, particularly, for example, among the LDCs where they had a lot of data gaps. They have the most recent data, we've seen an increase in coverage in the LDCs, which is very good news. But I would like to also mention the fact that the current COVID crisis has been a huge challenge for many of these countries. For example, some SIDS are only just starting to open up, and tourism is a critical part of their economy. That whole sector has been cancelled for a couple of years now. So we're facing, so within the finance constraints, SIDS are facing particular constraints. I would like to just turn to adaptation very briefly, because this really is one of the priorities. Angel mentioned the absence of data on mitigation and greenhouse gas inventories. This is absolutely correct, and I would say that corporate reporting is a little further behind than perhaps national reporting, because national reporting, they've had 25 years of experience and have built up the methods and so on, and the quality of the data. But on the corporate side, there's much less corporate reporting and much less reporting by other entities than in the global south than in the global north. But just to turn to adaptation, this really is a critical sector for the least developed and the landlocked and the SIDS, because they are really on the front line of climate change. And part of the problem, one of the challenges is that you need to have the conceptual, you need to have the methodological frameworks in place. Now, those all have to be developed. And that is that requires a capacity which is beyond just a warm body in a national statistics office, but really it's something that needs to be built up. It was built up on the greenhouse gas inventory side and the modeling of emissions, but that needs to be done for adaptation. It concerns formulating policy. It also is related to accessing finance. And there, the developing countries have found that the data needs for preparing the project proposals in order to access finance is very challenging. And the whole process for having the projects approved and being bankable is also drawing resources. So they have issued a strong call for simplifying those procedures, many of which are related to generating the data themselves. So, and one, for example, problem is the fact that often these proposals require data, time series data, and the historical data not always available. So even if you put in place the methods now and put in place the collection systems now to get the historical data, they're not always available. Then I would like to just make a quick mention of the guidelines for adaptation communications. This is a process within UN-OHRLLS, and that's something which is certainly going to help bridge gaps and help build a common understanding and knowledge. Second point I'd like to make is the whole, and I link up to your point, Angel, on the global stocktake, because within that, there's also something called the Global Goal on Adaptation. Now, this is something which is a little bit challenging because it requires some kind of global consensus on what we mean by making progress on adaptation. But this is something which is going to be very useful and important also for the most vulnerable countries, because what we are lacking right now are good indicators on adaptation progress. So when we're reporting on our adaptation and we're trying to assess how much progress we've made, it's really useful. It will be very useful to have some of this knowledge gaps and common understanding filled, and this is a process which will be taking place over the coming years within the UNFCCC. So really, I mean, I've sort of mentioned several different things. I think I'll just stop there. I'll summarize, to summarize really data gaps, methodological gaps, they're interlinked, both need to be addressed. I think it will take time, it'll take resources. On the corporate, there are a lot of data gaps in terms of finance and FDI, and how much is being directed to the private sector in developing countries, particularly in the least developed countries, for example. Very little is known about how much investment is being made in mitigation. But these are gaps which I think, particularly from the policy-making point of view on adaptation, this really is a top priority, I would say, for these groups of countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will, while I'm heading over to some of the more interactive part, where I'm actually opening up your suggestions that the audience has put on the Menti. I'm also gonna try to summarize a little bit what has been said, which is quite interesting. So Aniket, Angel, if you wanted to look at these, there's quite a bit of suggestions for the challenges already. There's been some suggestions for the opportunities. So audience, if you want to add more to the particular opportunities of what you think might happen, should happen with climate data, this is also very interesting. But just to summarize, I mean, an interesting spectrum that I heard and connections that I heard between you two was particularly around the actions that need to happen on a lot of different levels. There's kind of like everything happening from a global UN level around big frameworks and treaties that are trying to really make this more streamlined and trying to address this, but also like feeding the information up, like Angel said, through the global stocktake, which will provide a very comprehensive picture that then can still help to feed it back down and say, what is the information that's needed? What is the call to action there, for example, with the global stocktake? And being just like, it's interesting, this is how far it gets us with what everyone is doing, but like, what does that mean for what needs to happen? Particularly not only thinking just around the UN and the national governments, but really thinking about local organizations, local governments, cities, corporates, and so on. So I do think like this is some of the, I mean, this is an interesting area. It also brings in why this climate data part is so difficult, because you're looking at all of these different, you're looking at very multidimensional issue, not only because of the nature of climate change, but because of the nature of like what climate action is, that it needs to happen in a coordinated way globally, but also needs to translate into something that is that is much more locally, and particular takes into account that the situation, the starting points that different regions might come from vary a bit. And it's, for example, interesting that that's not only the point around mitigation, it's also the point around it's obvious in adaptation, but it's also important in mitigation, for example, that there's just like very little reporting that's still happening around the globe, and it's very there's a very big difference between the global north and the global south. So I think there's some really interesting pieces that we can take as an input to this update blog. I might wanted to see before I ask like maybe specific question, Angel, is there any reaction that you have either to what Aniket said or to things that you've seen that the audience is submitting here as challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think your reflection about just the complexity of climate action and how we measure it is really on point, because I think that that's really the crux of the challenge. Because when, I mean, different perspectives, different people, different aspects of climate change, whether you're talking about mitigation, adaptation, resilience, they all have their own issues. And I mean, I think we're most probably developed on the mitigation side because it's pretty straightforward to think in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide. But yeah, I think what Aniket said about the adaptation piece, and I was really struck by that statistic about the 30% in terms of gaps for SDGs. I actually thought it would be higher, so I think 30% actually is not that bad. I think that that's definitely workable. I would have assumed like greater than 50%. But yeah, I mean, I think that it's a definitional challenge first and foremost, and I think exactly what you presented about defining the problem and then thinking about, well, what is the kind of data that would help to answer or address that particular problem, and then thinking about, okay, well, then how do we actually get that data? It's a full like causal chain, and I think often we're not making those connections in terms of thinking about climate action. So, I mean, I think in terms of a lot of the data that we work with, often it's like, okay, now we're trying to deal with incomplete data or trying to make sense of what currently exists. And it's just, you know, it's not fit for purpose. And so then that makes it even more challenging. So I think, yeah, a lot of these observations that people contributed, I completely agree with in terms of interoperability and yeah, the fact that, yeah, scope 3, that's a huge challenge, not just from companies, but also for cities, and thinking about out of boundary emissions, which can be as much as 2/3 of a city's overall carbon footprint. So yeah, a lot of really good contributions here. I'm hoping more people will submit opportunities.
Yeah, exactly. And I should unmute myself if I'm trying to. Yeah, exactly. Definitely submit opportunities. These are kind of like the pieces that I actually want to get to, and maybe this is a question, Aniket, to put you on the spot there with this question. Then I see we have an audience question, but I want to ask this question first because it's about getting a little bit of thinking going around opportunities. Do you have any specific example that comes to mind where like open climate data, particularly because it's obviously framed around like open climate data was transparent, where you really seen that it made a difference? Like maybe there was something where data was not previously available, or it was like behind closed doors, then was opened and it really made a difference in either like planning or participation or something, where you really saw like, this is a good example how data, if it's done well, can actually like show these opportunities. This is kind of like get thoughts a little bit flowing and then go to Q&A with the audience.
Yeah. Yes, well, I would like to come to the whole question of foreign direct investment in least developed countries, because this is, you know, really a critical source of finance for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, for advancing climate action, a whole range of different issues. And it's a challenge, and it's something which our office seeks to support in different ways. Now, one whole area, so one of the big challenges that, and we hear this again and again from different sources, that one of the things that the private sector, you know, traditional investors, one of the obstacles is the lack of available data in least developed countries. So many companies are sort of shying away from investments because the picture is not known. And among that picture is the whole question of climate risk, which is becoming more of a consideration now. And particularly as these countries are among, you know, the most are on the front line of climate change. If you, I won't cite the examples now, but we all know them. Some of the big climate events that we've seen over the last 2-3 years, the impacts in least developed countries and SIDS are pretty big. So one area where, and I alluded to it earlier on from the government side, which is the Sendai Framework Monitor. But equally, there are a couple of reporting frameworks that are around. But one of them is being developed by UN-DRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. And in particular, they have a Bonn office, which is collecting and publishing data on climate, on losses, on various kinds of losses suffered from disasters at the national level. So this kind of information, which is, they've been strengthening this reporting framework. And I think their next step, which incidentally and very interestingly is being fed from diverse sources of diverse actors. So it's not exclusively a government reported data, but it's data that's coming from a lot of different levels. So I think tools like this can really help inform investment decisions and can provide the basis for developing and promoting insurance schemes for small and medium-sized enterprises and poor households, which is another project that we are involved in to try to sort of support what's a UNDP-led program. So these kinds of, this information, which is traditionally not readily available, but if you can fill those gaps, then it will be much easier for corporates to put together a more robust business case scenario, which would help them to make the decisions they need in order to make much needed investments in developing countries, particularly those that are furthest behind.
Great, thank you. This was a great example, and thank you, audience, for adding more on the opportunities, because we want to hear your opinions and perspective. What do you think? Angel, I'm gonna ask you one of the audience questions that goes exactly in the same direction, particularly on an area that you might be working on. Sariti is asking, do you know of good examples using open climate data and machine learning for multi-solving system thinking for implementation of climate solution in cities, particularly?
This is a really great question, and there are a couple of initiatives that I would point Shruti to. I think one is the Climate Change AI initiative. If you're not familiar, I'll put the link into the chat. So I think it's just climatechange.ai, and that's a project that was started a few years ago, specifically looking at the question of AI machine learning applications to address different aspects of climate change. And so they have a whole paper and a repository of examples of where people are using data and integrating with smart grids, improving energy efficiency, in the guise of smart cities and smart city projects, also trying to use large data sets on traffic patterns to optimize efficiency and minimize transport related emissions. So I think that's a really good example. And then there's also, I think, a great paper that was written by Felix Kreutzig and his colleague, maybe just last year, and I can send a link. And if you don't have a copy of this paper, I think that there's like a white paper version of this as well, but where they did a survey looking at machine learning applications specifically in urban areas. So those are two that I think are really good resources to look at how different cities have been using open climate data, or the opportunity for applying open climate data and machine learning for urban mitigation and related solutions. And I will just give a plug for one of our projects. We have been using citizen science data and sending citizens in the Chapel Hill, Raleigh-Durham area where I currently live. And so sending them out with handheld sensors to collect high resolution temperature and humidity data. And then we've been using that data within machine learning models combined with aerial imagery on land cover and remote sensing data on tree cover to develop a super high resolution map of urban heat exposure that we're working directly with the local town of Chapel Hill policymakers to help them identify where they might be best poised to implement urban heat mitigation solutions, such as increasing tree cover or shade, or trying to also think about identifying hotspots of where they might want to pay particular attention in the case of extreme heat waves. So that's one example personally of where we're working locally to apply machine learning and open climate data, and also citizen power to address climate change.
Great, thank you, Angel. And audience, please feel free to continue, submit any questions. Oh yeah, we have another question on the Menti, either through Zoom or Menti. So I'm gonna go to this question here real quick. Regarding scale, global, regional, national, local, how does the availability of open climate data appropriate for those scales correspond to where the biggest climate action opportunities are? That's a very good questions, because there's obviously a variety of, this is kind of like matching up the challenges with the opportunities, because there might be big gaps on information on either of these scales, but it's also a question who are the the kind of actors who need to actually like act to address climate change. Again, the one thing that to keep this in mind, this could relate to either like mitigation information to really see that reduce emissions, or adaptation or finance or other just transition things, just to keep this in mind. But I'm happy for I can also jump in afterwards. But Aniket, do you have any perspective on this? Otherwise, also happy to give it to Angel.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would like to perhaps address the question of offsets and emission reduction units or whatever, because when one mentions opportunities and that does make you bring to mind the whole question of economic efficient emission reduction allocations. And we will be seeing, of course, how Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is implemented and fleshed out. But it would be very important, I believe, to have robust sort of verification and open data on what corporates and governments are doing to when they affirm net zero action. And net zero action means, of course, reducing, but then also the offsetting. So whereas under the Kyoto Protocol, we had emission reduction units and the CDM and so on, there's a big question about how we can ensure that all these commitments and their implementation are both robust and meaningful and additional and so on. So I would say that the whole open data question or climate change data on that would be very important to have that out in the public domain so that it could bear to scrutiny at the highest environmental standards. Thank you.
Sorry. Angel, do you have any reaction to this question?
Yeah, I mean, this is the $1 million question, right? How can we make the multiple scales of data that are emerging that currently exist appropriate to correspond to where the biggest climate action opportunities are? I mean, I think that that's like really the $1 million question. And what I find in working with policy and looking at evaluating the impact of climate actions, this is really the challenge. It's really difficult to take measurements because if you're thinking about satellites or weather stations or satellite data, they're measuring ambient emissions in the atmosphere. And for carbon dioxide, they can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So then to try to relate that data down at the individual level to a firm, to a city, to a state, even to a country, that's extremely difficult to do that type of attribution. So then when you can't even do that, it's because it's even more difficult to then identify opportunities and say, oh, well, we see that there is a hotspot of emissions coming here. And so maybe we need to see what's going on and dig a little bit deeper to identify the opportunities. Now for methane, I think actually that's an area where there's a lot of promising opportunity because there are satellites. Environmental Defense Fund is one example of where they're launching a satellite called MethaneSat. And now the US has at the COP26 that they launched this global methane partnership that has close to 100 countries that are all working on monitoring methane. So I think, and methane is different. It's short-lived compared to carbon dioxide. And then they come from very distinct sources, either from power plants or from oil and gas leakages. And so it's easier to spot from a satellite perspective. So I think there's some potential there to really, I think, narrow in and identify these point sources. But for just general emissions, that's just one example of how challenging the problem is, where we have data, we're seeing more and more data come online, but then to then relate it to a scale where we know, okay, well, if company X does this or city Y does that, that's going to lead to some sort of measurable change in emissions. I think that that's really challenging. So I think we need a lot more innovation in that space.
Yeah. And to also add to this, because this is very, very on point on this question, when we talk about what are the biggest climate action opportunities, it's always good to ask, like, by whom exactly, because this is kind of like the example that Angel mentioned, but it applies actually to a lot of other topics like adaptation as well. is you have these great maps that NASA and other put out where you see like all of the emission flows, kind of like it's a nice flowy map of the globe where like all of the CO2 kind of flows around basically. And this is kind of like, it's nice global data, but who will act on this? Who is the person that can take this kind of map or this information and then actually do something about it? So the interesting thing is you need to, and there's a particular challenge that when you look into satellite measurements, for example, of emissions, which have been like hailed as a huge opportunity, it needs to be very specific on being this like, who is the actor that might actually need that data? If you have these emission maps, as long as you cannot translate it back towards either a city or like a company or a facility or something that causes these emissions, or a pipeline leak that can be addressed by an operator kind of thing. That's often the gap that then exists. There's like a lot of data being collected, but it's the gap towards translating it to someone who can either raise ambition, or like the pipeline examples are very good with methane. It's a very good example, can act in a timely manner. That's where data actually might be really interesting, because if you measure methane pipeline leaks in a very timely manner, and you know who is responsible for it, and you know who needs to address it, there you have an actor, you have a timely problem, you have things that you identify that can be then have real life actions to reduce emissions in the short term kind of thing. So this is always the thinking that's quite helpful when people talk about like the big opportunities kind of things. So things like who's taking which action and what exactly. We are getting closer to the hour. I'm just going to see what the other question that we have on the Menti is, and then we can also see not to be confused, the Zoom invitation is actually for an hour and a half. We suggest to make it an hour because we don't want to keep people too long, so we can go a couple minutes over, but we will try to wrap it up. So I'll see if there's other questions that are coming in, and then kind of summarize it and hand it over to our colleagues from Data for Development to wrap up this roundtable. Again, this Menti is actually open for a couple more days. So if you want to add more perspectives, or even if you want to be a reviewer or a commenter on the blog that we want to write, you can definitely reach out to us and continue to contribute. But let's see what the other questions is that we have here. Why isn't there more open data, and what can we do to open up existing data silos? There's a lot of good data out there. That's a very interesting and very relevant question. Angel, Aniket, do you want to do quick interventions? And then I'm going to see if there's other questions before we wrap up.
Yes, well, I would like to maybe just come to adaptation, because we've been talking about mitigation and so on. And just to mention that very often there isn't data full stop. I'd like to just make a connection between 2 points. One of them is, first of all, what are the drivers of data collection in countries which are facing, shrinking fiscal space due to COVID and others, and which in any case would have been facing challenges in staffing a data collection person in a national statistics office. So what is driving data collection? Basically, it is coming from a government budget, but if you don't have the government budget allocation, then you may get a one-off cash shot to put in place the methodologies and the data collection system through an international funding mechanism such as the GEF, which is linked to your reporting requirements as a national entity in relation to your international commitments. So you'll get some money to do that, but that's not going to fund a whole staff position in perpetuity. It will really just help you set the whole thing up. So there remains a challenge for some of these smaller countries. And for example, some SIDS, the National Statistics Office, its entirety is just a few people. Some SIDS are 10,000 people. Others, a medium-sized SID is 100,000 people. That is a few square blocks of Manhattan where I am now. So really just to understand the scale and the size and magnitude. So some data collection solutions on climate have been proposed from a regional or a sub-regional context, and that makes sense, and it helps to overcome some of these challenges of small size. But once you have those data, so imagine, for example, the Solomon Islands, where they have now been confronted for the first time with relocation from outlying islands to some of the closer mainland islands, of relocation of communities I'm talking about because of climate change. So when we're talking about data collection and open data, just accessing and getting hold of data about what the realities on the ground are in such low-lying and out and remote areas, it's a huge challenge. Even if you've overcome the challenge of having a staff person who is there to periodically collect. Fiji, another SID, is in the process of developing its relocation policy. So they actually have a policy in order to how to relocate people and do that in a manner that is respectful of all communities, that takes into account the cultural challenges, the identity challenges, all the different of both the communities that are being relocated and the recipient communities. So these are some of the things that sort of, there's data, but then you need to go beyond the data as well. And how do you even access the data in these remote areas? So just to bring in from the adaptation perspective, particularly of the SIDS, these are some of the challenges that they're facing.
To add to what Aniket said, and I 100% agree, I think, yeah, just having like a baseline of understanding where countries stand on an issue like climate adaptation, it's really critical. And Johannes, in your preparation, you also asked us to think about the role of different data brokers like government, NGOs, scientists, and the private sector in open climate ecosystem. And I think that this relates to the question that was just asked of how do we provide incentives? And I think this is exactly what we need to do. I think you need to have different players and stakeholders in society, from government requiring disclosure. I mean, Aniket mentioned that corporations, particularly in the global south, are far behind governments in providing this data. So we need to be requiring disclosure. The United States is just now, I think, embarking on this process through the SEC and requiring mandatory firm and corporate disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. And already that's motivated a lot more private sector investment into developing systems and approaches to help them do this and to comply with these requirements. And I think without the SEC requirement, there wouldn't have been this flurry of activity. You wouldn't have companies like Persephone getting $10 million of Series B funding to do this, and more startups popping up to help companies. And so I think that's exactly what we need. We need the governments, AOSIS, small island developing states, LDCs included, to say, this is really important. We need to have data on climate change, and then that can motivate private sector and public sector investment, because I think right now climate data is vastly underfunded. It's not valued. People think that it's a public good, it's free, and frankly, it shouldn't be. There's a cost that's involved with producing these data sets, with collecting data, investing in monitoring technology in these next generation approaches. And we're not going to get there. We're not going to be able to improve the state of climate data if we don't have investment. And so I think that's what's really key. I think we need to have regulation, very clear signals from the top to say that this is something that it's not an option. This shouldn't be voluntary. You have to do it. And then I think that will get the private sector on board, and also investment community on board. And then you could get scientists like myself also helping to contribute and identifying, okay, well, what data is really necessary? What signals are we seeing from data? What kinds of information should be collected? And the NGOs, I think also, like the work that you're doing, Johannes, on the Climate Watch data is absolutely critical to then making this data accessible and easily understandable for various audiences and for stakeholders. I think we all need to be working together on this question. So thanks so much, whoever asked that, because I think this is really critical consideration. Great.
Those were great additions, and I think this is like the perfect way to wrap this roundtable up. What comes to mind, Angel, one of the things that I've learned a while ago is, not sure if you ever heard about this saying, data wants to be free. I'd say it called data wants to be free and open. It's an interesting thing because this quote sometimes flies around, but it's actually, what I've stumbled across was that it's actually just part of a quote. The second quote is actually, but on the other hand, data wants to be like costly and wants to be closed, because it's not quite this easy. It's like data takes effort. Data takes, even if it's open climate data, it takes effort to create. And there's big incentive still to hold data back and to not make it openly accessible. And this is something to what Aniket said, kind of things. There is a pieces around like not only what should be published, but what is the public or other actors should be knowing. What should they be knowing about is an important factor. So I'm going to leave you with this with this two-part quote. Data wants to be free, but sometimes it actually does not want to be free. And want to thank the panelists and particularly the audience to contribute so much. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but there's a lot more things that were contributed now. We're definitely going to take this away, and then again, like you will find I can post my email also in the chat, or you can Google. You will find me online if you want to reach out to me or want to become a reviewer of this blog, for example. I'll be always happy to give get like a wide range of more input. But with this, I'm gonna hand it over to Muchiri from Data for Development to wrap us up.
Thank you, Johannes, and Angel and Aniket. Thank you for a very enlightening session. I didn't realize just how pressing the problem of funding for climate action data is. It's clearly not just those areas that I'm perpetually complaining about, like agriculture, but clearly there is a need in a very adjacent central area of climate action as well. So I'm taking a very selfish lens, I suppose, in reviewing this. So I'd like to thank you for your input, and I'm sure Johannes will find a lot of the questions and input that is received valuable in authoring the refreshed content for the chapter in the State of Open Data on Climate Action. Appreciate it. We've come to the end of today's series of roundtables. This was the second for today. 2 more roundtables in our series of 5. So we're back tomorrow at 1300 GMT for our State of Open Data roundtable on national statistics. It should be followed thereafter by the session on open data for anti-corruption at 1500 GMT. So thank you for being part of this and for all the input in Menti and in the chat. This live stream, of course, will remain online. It is recorded, so please do share it. If you know someone who didn't make it today and you think they would appreciate the content and probably contribute also to the Menti, which NSA will be up still after this, please do share it. I'm sure we will appreciate the opportunity to engage with voices and participants beyond those who are able to join us today. So that's about it for today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are, and see you next time. Bye-bye.